I was asked to give an invited address at the Parapsychological Association meeting for 2018 held at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in August. And I thought for a long time about what would I talk about. There are so many interesting things that I've been involved with in researching consciousness, altered states, parapsychology, and the like. Finally, I narrowed it down to a couple of things that I really wanted to focus on. Due to illness, I was unable to deliver my talk on August 3rd as I was scheduled to, so this is a video I'm making from my home office to make up for it. I'm very rebellious of tradition in certain ways, and it seems like an old tradition in academic and scientific circles is when you give a lecture, you use slides that are very complex, that the words aren't too small a size type to be made out in the back of the room, and you flash them on for a second and go on to something else, which might fool some people into thinking you're very smart, and also covers up a chance for people to see your slides in enough detail to be able to criticize them. The slide you're seeing here is the focus slide. I always ask people to start displaying before I even get up to talk, so that people who are already sitting in a place where they're too far back to see have a chance to change it. I particularly love this Escher type slide, okay? And I think of it possibly as what's been called a permanent paranormal object. This thing is there, if you could actually build it, and there's no doubt there's something very strange about it. If you could actually build it, how would you do it? With some kind of psychokinesis or mind over matter? Maybe it'd be easier with telepathically induced hallucinations in the people looking at it to save on that steel. Maybe draw on quantum non-locality, whatever that means, but it's a great buzzword. Ultra-tiny oscillations of invisible strings running into the past, present, and future. I don't know. Whatever weird ideas I have, I find are quickly dwarfed by what are considered respectable ideas within physics. So not that long after I came up with the idea of this possible permanent paranormal object, an issue of New Scientist came in, shown in the next slide here, that is about going beyond quantum physics, with its motto being that no matter how weird you think it is now, it's going to be even worse. So who knows what that will bring. If you think our best theory of reality is weird now, says the physicist, stay tuned. Now, when I was invited to give this address, I decided I want to take you on a trip. A mental trip where instead of rigorously evaluating the data for and against particular ideas, you think about whether the ideas are interesting or not. When I worked with physicists for a few years, I found that's one of the ways some of the breakthroughs in physics were made. Somebody thought it would be interesting to think about an idea and what its consequences would be. I mean, when Einstein thought about what would it be like if you could ride through space alongside a light beam, what a crazy idea, but it led to a very interesting place. So I'm very empirically grounded. I love science and its insistence that we come back to the data as finally deciding on something is really vital to me, because otherwise I tend to get carried away with ideas. But today I'm going to ask you to take a trip on two very interesting ideas, and don't worry about the evidence, the practicality, the resources and everything yet, but if these were true, where would it go? And actually, I really need to inspire you to think about where it would go, because the possibilities are way beyond what I can think of. So help me, please. Take a trip, as it were. And since this meeting is in California, that seems to be very appropriate. Now, this talk was scheduled for 4 o'clock after a busy day of papers. Very interesting stuff. I want to share so much. But people are pretty tired at a convention by hearing papers. So on the one hand, I should say interesting things, and on the other, I should try to entertain. So let me see. Here's the official title slide for the talk, Parapsychology as an Essential Component of an Expanded Theory of Mind, Promises and Challenge. My goodness, doesn't that sound academic? But that's all right to start a paper, so it sounds pretty academic. I think a better title to it that I couldn't get in at the last minute, shown in the next slide, would be Putting the Psyche Back into Psychology. I'm rather old-fashioned in my interest in psychology then. I think the mind experience per se is worth studying on its own terms, not simply assuming that they being the neurologists, will explain it all away someday. Actually, it's been promised that they will explain it away for my whole lifetime, and I don't see it as getting anywhere. So, let me skip ahead slightly in my notes here. My goal in presenting these ideas, and indeed a theme throughout my entire career as a psychologist, has been helping to create a science of mind, looking at mind as something worth studying in its own right. As I said earlier, putting the psyche back in psychology. Well, how does psychology work now? The next slide, my fifth one, shows a little diagram of three things you can observe from a person. You can ask them to report on what their mind is doing. You can measure what goes on in their body, the physiological measures, and you can look at their behavior. What do they actually do? How does that compare with what their body says, what they report, and so forth, and hopefully integrate that into a better understanding of what goes on. Now, for a long time, self-report hasn't been all that popular in psychology. And in fact, if you look back at the history of psychology, after we managed to escape from the theology departments and the philosophy departments, we tried to form a science of psychology that you might say was analogous to a mental chemistry, where experiences were basic data. And just like in chemistry, you start out with these complex compounds and things act funny and you don't particularly see any reason why, but you begin to get it down to what are the more basic elements and the rules for combining those things, and pretty soon you have modern chemistry. Well, not necessarily pretty soon, but it can be done. But when I say I'd like to recreate a mental chemistry, those of you who know anything about the history of psychology will say, well, that was tried and it failed. Just didn't work. The reports from different laboratories contradicted each other all the time. You couldn't make sense out of things. Well, I'm not a historian of psychology, but looking back at it, I've been able to come up with what I think are 6 major reasons why this early attempt to form psychology as a mental science failed. The first slide shows one of those reasons, and that was basically ignoring individual differences. It was assumed that somehow when you studied a person in the psychology laboratory, you had a standard person, and if you could see how their mind worked, it was like the way everybody's mind worked. And it turns out there are huge differences in the way different people's minds work. And if you just try to combine that all instead of understanding the differences, you get a mishmash. Those of you who've been in a long-term relationship with a loved one where you've tried to figure out how his or her mind works, probably understand that at least one other person in the world, and probably a lot of other persons in the world, have minds that can work in a very different sort of way. The second major reason I think attempts at mental chemistry failed was the problem of experimenter bias. That's shown in the next slide there. These people who were reporting on their experiences were assistants, way down in status from Herr Doctor Professor. A lot of this was done in German laboratories, very authoritarian kind of culture. And in some ways, their jobs depended on pleasing Herr Doctor Professor, who in many cases as an authoritarian personality knew how these things should work. I don't think there was anywhere near enough attention paid to the fact that this tended to bias what kind of reports they get. A third example, shown in the next slide, why mental chemistry failed, is what I call culture boundedness. Culture boundness. What I mentioned before, very authoritarian cultures, for instance, compared with, say, egalitarian cultures. Or the fact that you're normal for your culture, which means actually that the way you perceive the world, think about the world, feel about the world, act on the world, is all specialized to fit in with the norms of your culture, which of course you think are the right sensible ways that any intelligent person would do. But people in different cultures, their minds are shaped in different kinds of ways. If you ignore that, again, you get too much noise and variation. Another example shown in the next slide of why this attempt at mental chemistry failed is what I call insufficient training and or a lack of method. Experimenters sometimes said they trained their subjects for 10 to 20 hours to report on their experiences accurately. Well, you call that training? Okay. But nowadays we know something about the various meditative traditions, for instance. And I've talked to a number of meditation teachers who say, well, if you want to talk about a trained meditator, someone who's particularly good at observing and reporting on the qualities of their mind, you're talking about something that might take 5,000 to 10,000, maybe even 20,000 hours of training. So they had untrained observers. No wonder the reports weren't very reliable. A fifth reason mental chemistry failed, in that next slide, is what I call the dominance of materialism. There was already a widespread bias in the culture that the physical sciences were the sciences. That's where you could get really accurate and true descriptions of what went on, and all these mental reports you get were inherently inferior. Well, when you know what you're doing is inferior by definition, that kind of lends a tone to the whole thing that's not going to make for the development of accurate and useful reporting. And finally, as shown in the next slide, the sixth reason that mental chemistry didn't work was the inherent assumption enshrined in many philosophies, it certainly seems to have a lot of common sense backing, is that your experience is inherently private. You are the only person who can really have a direct look at what your experience is. So anything you say about it is already a derivation, an abstraction, a possibly biased report. Nobody else can look to see if you're reporting it accurately. Well, again, like the doctrine that if it's not a physical science, it's inherently inferior, this undercuts the whole activity to begin with. You know that you may try hard, but you're going to get inferior data, so what's the point? One of my favorite philosophers, although not usually thought of as a philosopher, Henry Ford, had this nice saying, those who think they can and those who think they can't are both right. It's true. So developing a science of mind is going to be hard. Like they say, old age is not for sissies. I don't think developing a science of mind is for sissies either, but I think we can do it. How? Let's put on a blank slide there so we don't get stuck on that list of problems there and talk about that. The most exciting thing in parapsychology in the half century I've been involved has been the development of remote viewing techniques and the practical success in using them for intelligence gathering. Almost exclusively for intelligence gathering about the external world. Where someone in a room in Fort Meade is said, tell me about today's target, which is listed in a sealed envelope, but nobody in the room knows that it's a certain location somewhere in the middle of Siberia, and they get, useful information about that. Not 100% accurate, sometimes totally wrong, but they get enough useful information that over the more than 20 years that the various intelligence agencies of the government supported remote viewing, it tells me there were 504 psychic spying missions. Let's call them what they were, psychic spying missions. There were 504 missions spread over 19 different intelligence and military organizations. Of those 19 organizations, 17 returned with requests for new missions. One joint task force came back 172 times alone. Somebody was getting a lot of useful information and supporting that. The other striking example to me of the use of remote viewing techniques has been the archaeological work that Stephen Schwartz and his colleagues have done. I've hiked a lot in the deserts of the Southwest. Everywhere you look, there's undulating sand dunes and rocks and scattered plants. How you can give somebody a large-scale map of Egypt and say, I want a site that contains such and such a kind of object, please draw circles where it'll happen, and using several psychics and knowing how to combine their information, you eventually get down to a place where you dig and you find stuff like that. Wow, that is practical intelligence operation. Note also what I just said about Schwartz's work too. It's teamwork rather than just an individual remote viewer or psychic. There's an assumption that every individual remote viewer gives you information that's both signal and noise. Sometimes it's probably mostly noise, sometimes it's probably mostly signal. But if you learn how to usefully integrate the characteristics of these various remote viewers, you can find out very interesting stuff about the physical world. So let's start applying that to developing a science of mind, a mental chemistry. The next slide shows the initial steps for doing this. We start out in the left-hand side of the slide with what I might call conventional remote viewing research. We find naturally talented physical world remote viewers. We give them tests that are essentially work samples to see that they're really good at it. So if remote viewing can work so well under optimal conditions for finding information about the external world, the physical world, why not for the internal world? Can you see things, view things remotely with some kind of psi about what's going on in another person's mind? Can we break down that limiting assumption that experience is inherently private and you can't really get anywhere with that? Okay, the next slide will show you the procedure there. Look at the right-hand side of that now. First off, you want to have some clear targets of internal experiences to find out what your viewers can be trained to do. So you develop some trained introspectionists. People can observe their own internal processes, create certain experiences and hold them relatively steadily and report them accurately. And then you find whether your remote viewing team can accurately report on this. This may take a lot of fooling around to figure out how to do it well. And again, you'll gradually build a team where you calibrate for the individual strengths and weaknesses of particular viewers and figure out how to combine their reports in the most useful way. And incidentally, those who've practically worked with various intelligence agencies will realize there's actually quite a bit known about how to combine different kinds of intelligence reports to maximize the signal and minimize the noise. When you've got consistent reports from your remote viewers that match what your introspectionists, who of course are sensorially isolated from the remote viewers, when they match those things, then you've got the ability to get a second perspective on internal events. But that's not the end. Suppose your remote viewers start reporting events that your introspectors say, no, I didn't create a target like that. I didn't spontaneously experience anything like that. But you get consistent reports from your remote viewing team that such and such a kind of experience happened. Are you beginning to look at parts of the mind that are actually there but are inherently inaccessible, or at least normally inaccessible to the people who are having, I'm going to say having the experience, but of course we associate it with their mind, but they're not having the experience. Can you get at the subconscious? That would be extremely interesting. Now, that might be getting a little bit wild, so I would like to ground that in observables as soon as possible. And so I want to talk about applying remote viewing of internal processes to psychotherapy as one example. It's possible that you could get psychic interaction among your remote viewing team such that they came up with the same idea and reported it as a remote viewing, but in point of fact it was a shared delusion among your viewing team. Really had nothing to do with the person, the introspector that they were looking at. Okay, so one way to start checking is this. There are many kinds of psychotherapy, of course. But in a number of them, the idea that if the client can have insight into normally hidden aspects of their mental functioning, that would help them deal with the nature of the problem and produce an observable improvement in their presenting symptoms, in their lifestyle, and something like that. So let's say, can you get insights or potential insights from your remote viewing team that actually help a psychotherapist help a client? The next slide shows that particular possibility. I've got Uncle Sam on the couch there. I didn't intend to get deliberately political, but it's hard not to in this particular time. If the things reported by the remote viewing team, who of course has no sensory contact with the client or the therapist, help the therapist guide the client in the course of therapy to more effective, more rapid kinds of insights that help them improve, then I think we're on to something. Now, there are many spontaneous reports, or I think I'd rather call them field observations, of psychic interaction between therapist and client in psychotherapy scattered through the old literature. So those kinds of things can happen. So this is a complex proposed test as to whether we can get past that inherent privacy, but if it helps in psychotherapy, maybe we really are getting a deeper look at the mind. Where might that take it? And of course, there are obvious ethical problems here. Therapists need to learn more skilled ways to use this psychic information and so forth. I think you should get clients' permission to have any kind of psychic scanning of them. But since they're going to a therapist because they're suffering already and want the therapist to help them, I think we could get that. Anyway, if this worked out, as the next slide shows, we would have a fourth kind of data in a psychology of mind, in addition to physiological effects, behavior, self-reports. We'd have these psychic scans of what's going on, and I think we have a more complete kind of science of mind. Now, it's generally probabilistic answers rather than water is always dihydrogen monoxide, but I think it's leading us in an interesting direction. Now, when I was scheduled to give this talk for the Parapsychological Association, people had to sit in their chairs for an hour, and I could add this next very interesting stuff. But I've gradually learned that when people have the freedom to get up and leave, like you do, or take a coffee break or something like that, it's a good idea to make my second part, where I'm going to talk about applying parapsychological matters into the transpersonal, or into the spiritual aspect of human nature. Let's see where that goes. Okay, I've given you an interesting idea for expanding a science of mind. I hope you folks, you're all younger than me probably, have your careers ahead of you, will run with it, work out some of the complexities, and even if it turns out to be eventually wrong, we can find out a lot of interesting stuff in the meanwhile, and I think it will be an enormous improvement over the current state of parapsychology where we tend to get stuck in they want more proof and more proof and more proof and more proof. Oh, that's crazy. That will never get us anywhere. We've got to show that by applying psychic stuff in this way, we can add a major tool to developing a science of the mind, and maybe in other sciences too. Okay, if you continue on to the next part, that's going to be perhaps further out and even more interesting. Thank you.